Hey guys, this is Brett, and this is the Chapter 7 micro lecture on Generations of Praise Shield and Butsu. Um, this chapter is about the worship reformations. Um, the places of worship for the Protestant Reformation inherited the art and architecture of the Middle Ages. In the 4th century, churches began to build their own buildings based off basilicas. This is where the Romanesque style was developed. Gothic style was also made during this era. Some radical reformers rejected the ornate structure, such as Anabaptists. They rejected the ornate structure and imagery and met in houses or modest structures. The times of worship, it varied between the different reformers. Lutherans, reformers' calendar included daily prayer routines, fasting of Advent and Lent, celebrating of Christmas, circumcision, Epiphany, Good Friday, Easter, Ascension, and Pentecost, so it included all those things. Reformers in southern Germany and Switzerland were more radical, so first day of the week was celebrated as the Christians' Sabbath. Most celebrated Easter and Pentecost, and there were varying views on Christmas because it showed up so late in church history. English Reformation was a lot like the Lutheran, except for the Puritans and the Reformation in Scotland rejected most of the liturgical calendar, but they still had a heavy emphasis on the Christian Sabbath. Orders of worship also varied. Luther had his German Mass. It was basically the same order as Papal Mass, but it stayed away from complicated and secretive elements of the Lord's Supper, so it made it more oriented so the congregation could participate. Calvin tried to have a balance of the word and table in his service order, which he experienced in Strasbourg. Anabaptists tried to return to the New Testament for worship patterns. This, in return, made their services much more simple than Luther and Calvin and the Anglicans. The Anglicans were very complicated. They had service orders for different types of services, and in 1662, the Book of Common Prayer standardized the service. The best-known reformers were careful to make changes in liturgy slowly, and everything was based on Scripture, so that they didn't just go in and change everything. They slowly built up to changing things. Baptism was changed slowly. They first translated the baptismal rite, then they started to revise it. Ulrich Zwingli introduced that baptism is just merely an outward sign of an inward reality. Anabaptists did not believe in infant baptism. It was only for people who could choose to be baptized, and that's where their name came from, which means rebaptists. So they rebaptized themselves. If they were baptized as infants, they rebaptized themselves as in front of the community to show that they made the decisions on themselves. The Lord's Supper during this time, it varied as well. Luther came up with a doctrine of consubstantiation, which means Christ's presence is with the bread and wine, instead of the bread and wine actually becoming Christ's body. Zwingli said they are merely a representation of the body and blood, just an image. Bread and wine were far from being the body and blood; they were just reminders. Calvin is the middle of Luther and Calvin. He was in the balance. Christ isn't physically present because he's in heaven, but God has always accompanied revelation and grace with physical manifestations. So he had a balance of both of them in there. Anglicans continued the weekly communion. The first part of Mass was translated the first part of the Mass service that was translated to English was the communion service. Music, according to Zwingli, even though he was arguably the best musician of the major reformers, decided that congregational singing was distracting from the reception of the preached word, so he made a service with no music. Luther loved music, and he wrote songs. Calvin kind of followed after Luther, and but he limited to the congregational singing to just psalms translated into metrical French. And Knox did the same thing as Calvin, but in English. The preaching during this era, there was an eagerness to restore the preaching during this time. Most important was the practice of preaching through a biblical book in sequential fashion, which is much like a sermon series that we have today. So instead of jumping around all over the place with different scriptures that had no connection at all, the services, and as they went weekly or however they were together and had a relative theme within a group of services. Thanks.